The Rendlesham Triangle is a piece of landscape geometry that outwardly appears very simple, but is remarkable for two reasons. One is that its base angles are 50 degrees, extremely similar to those of the Great Pyramid, which are about 51.5 degrees. But also, its 3 points are very significant for seemingly different reasons. One is the place in Rendlesham Forest, where in 1980 Sergeant Jim Penniston of the US Air Force encountered a landed craft of unknown origin and touched it. The spot is marked on an aerial picture published in the book The Rendlesham Enigma by Jim Penniston and Gary Osborne. When he touched one of the glyphs on the craft, he seemingly had a download of a stream of ones and zeros in his head, which he later wrote down in his notebook. 30 years later, these were revealed to be binary code, giving a message including longitude and latitude references to several ancient sites around the world. One of these was the Great Pyramid. Another point was the Sutton Hoo ship burial, thought to be the burial place of King Raedwald of the Saxon Kingdom of East Anglia. The apex of the triangle is St Gregory's parish church at Rendlesham, which may be on the site of a temple built by Raedwald, which reputedly had a Christian altar at one end and a pagan altar at the other. The triangle points north, and the baseline runs through the Woodbridge Air Base, where the 1980 incidents occurred. The day after Sergeant Penniston's encounter, a glowing red object was seen to the north of the base. At the time, Jim Penniston was writing the code in his notebook, probably on the perpendicular of the triangle. The west side of the triangle was found several years ago and featured in the video The Lay Through Sutton Hoo and Rendlesham on the James Goddard Mysteries channel on YouTube. This is the triangle, with the landing point of the craft of unknown origin, Woodbridge Airfield, the Sutton Hoo ship burial, and St Gregory's Church, Rendlesham. Rendlesham and Sutton Hoo are both part of a 7th century royal estate in Suffolk of the kings of East Anglia. Although not absolutely proved, it's widely considered that King Raedwald was buried in the famous ship burial at Sutton Hoo, and the new Time team is involved with a project to reconstruct the ship. Raedwald is famous for having a temple with a pagan altar at one end and a Christian one at the other, as recorded by the Venerable Bede. The location of this is not known, but it must have been somewhere in the Rendlesham area. It seems to be a possibility, though, that St Gregory's Church at Rendlesham may stand on its site. This imposing 14th century building is by far the largest church in the area, and the church website, written by Simon Knott, says, "A straight path can be traced from here to Sutton Hoo, the royal burial ground, nowadays an archaeological site of national significance. The way the road diverts round the churchyard suggests that it is an ancient site, perhaps the site of a pagan temple. It's also dedicated to St Gregory the Great, the Pope who instructed St Augustine not to destroy pagan temples but convert them into churches." The next point on the line is Rendlesham Church, and it continues closely parallel with the straight road pointing to Sutton Hoo before reaching the ship burial. Nearby Rendlesham Forest is the landing place of a strange craft in the 1980s, witnessed by members of the nearby US Air Force base. Sergeant Jim Penniston reportedly touched the craft and received a message revealed 30 years later to be in binary code, giving longitude and latitude references to a number of prominent ancient sites around the world, and claiming an origin in the year 8100, 6,000 years in the future. See The Time Travellers of Rendlesham and the Earth Grid on the James Goddard Mysteries channel on YouTube for more information about this. There's an interesting ley joining the ship burial site with Rendlesham Church, which begins away to the northwest at Theberton Church. This was originally built in Norman times with a thatched roof and a round west tower. The striking south porch was added in the 15th century. The church was rebuilt in 1848. The line then continues to the ruined church of St Peter at Noddishall Green, built in 1066. In 1650 it was described as Buxlow Church decayed and ruinated time out of mind, and in 1721 parish abolished ecclesiastically to create Noddishall and Buxlow. Of the former parish church of Buxlow, no more survives than 2 chunks of walling of the tower, standing about 15 feet up. Documentation records the names of rectors from 1301 through to 1716, which indicates that the church survived the Reformation and even the Restoration in 1660. Some archaeologists maintain that the area around Buxlow was the location of the Roman fort Sitomagus, and that the name Buxlow is derived from the Saxon word for tumuli, or artificial mounds, which this area is said to have once been densely populated with. It then goes through Haddon Hall, before crossing the River Deben. Then it continues to the Seven Hills Barrow Cemetery, near Nacton, east of Ipswich. It continues to Sutton Church with its south tower, originally 14th century, but much altered in the 19th. The line then crosses the River Stour to reach another ruined church, St Mary's in Mistley, Essex. This medieval church has a claim to fame as the burial place of the infamous Witchfinder General Matthew Hopkins. It was replaced by a Georgian building designed by Robert Adam, but this too has gone, except for 2 towers. The ley following the east side of the triangle begins at the landing site of the craft of unknown origin in Rendlesham Forest, and continues to crossroads tracks there. It then goes on to Rendlesham Church, the apex of the triangle. Rendlesham has a rich history, including being the capital of Anglo-Saxon East Anglia before the church was built. The area was ruled by King Raedwald and the Woofinger, who led one of the major kingdoms in early medieval Europe. Some say that St Gregory's church in Rendlesham may be on the site of an original temple, and that the area may have been home to a royal hall and church of the Woofing kings. The present church was built in the 14th century, and is easily one of the largest churches in southeast Suffolk, another testament to the historic importance of the village. It stands in an isolated location well west of the village it serves. Rendlesham was once the capital of the kings of East Anglia, and the history of St Gregory's goes back to at least the 7th century. Indeed, the very name of the village hints at its Anglo-Saxon heritage, for the word Rendlesham is thought to come from a combination of words meaning place of the shield. Raedwald, a descendant of the first king of the East Angles, reigned from roughly AD 599 to 624. He was a Christian, but his wife was a pagan, so he came up with an ingenious solution. Raedwald established his royal church at Rendlesham, and in the church were 2 altars, one pagan and one Christian. He is believed to be the king buried in the famous ship burial at Sutton Hoo, a few miles to the southeast. It's certainly possible, given Rendlesham's importance as a royal seat of power, that Raedwald should be carried from the church here to burial at Sutton Hoo. No trace of the early church remains. The lay then continues to the priory church at Letheringham, which is the centre of several lays found when on holiday at Letheringham Mill several years ago. It was a small outlying cell of the Augustinian Priory of St. Peter and St. Paul in Ipswich that was founded at the end of the 12th century and was dedicated to the Virgin Mary. Through vandalism and neglect, the church was in serious disrepair by the late 1700s. In 1789, the church authorities directed the parish to repair the church. However, the church wardens arranged only for the nave to be restored, having its east end closed up, thus creating substantially the church that exists today. But records have survived that provide evidence of past splendours. Thomas Martin, who visited twice in 1723 and 1744, states, "I've neither seen nor read of any place except Westminster Abbey so fully adorned with such noble remains of antiquity." Horace Walpole in 1755 exclaims, "The church, which is scarce bigger than a large chapel, is very ruinous, though containing such treasures." Today it has a brick gatehouse of the late 15th and early 16th centuries, with 2 stories, parts of the nave of the monastic church, and a medieval 14th century tower now incorporated into the present church. The lay then goes on to a multi-junction at Brandeston, which Google Maps reveals as a slightly raised road island with a group of trees, seeming to be something like a mound, at the junction of Old Maids Lane and Low Street. It then goes to a small church just to the north of Brandeston, of which I could find no information on the web, but it was found on Google Maps Street View. This reveals it to be adjacent to a clump of Scots pines. Then it continues through 3 moats. These would probably all be medieval, but Alfred Watkins accepted moats as lay points because they so often occurred on lays. The first was at Sutton Hoo, Kenton, a medieval moated site with only fragments of a once square moat surviving. The second was at the village of Dublin, and no information could be found about this. The third is at Auckland, the one pictured here. It's a well-preserved rectangular moated site and surrounded by ploughed fields. The central platform, which is tree and vegetation covered, is surrounded by a wet moat 4 to 5 metres wide. There is no causeway. The baseline doesn't seem to have enough significant points on this map to qualify as a lay, but it probably is, as it goes through the landing place and the ship burial. But it does go on to St Mary's Church, Tuddenham. The tower is the earliest part, from just before 1400, while the chancel and nave appear to date from the early 15th century. Here is an earlier video of the findings at Letheringham, including the Abbey Church that the eastern side of the triangle passes through. It was at a cottage adjoining Letheringham Mill. This mill, dating back to about the 18th century, is the latest in a succession of mills on the site, dating at least to Domesday, probably much further back. In the garden was once a small Saxon church, and remains from the graveyard have been dug up all over the area. It was a very pleasant riverside spot, but we both had a feeling of brooding sadness about it. We didn't discover the existence of the graveyard till quite late in the holiday. The ground seemed quite idyllic, with the River Deben running through it, and there was even a rowing boat which we were allowed to use. I decided one day to row a little way down the river with my son, but as we proceeded further, the feeling became worse, eventually becoming such terror we had to turn back. There was nothing visible that could have caused this. This is Letheringham Hall, an ancient moated house. What you see at the moment is mainly Victorian, but there's been a hall on this site since before the dissolution of the monasteries, and it's said that Cardinal Wolsey brought a French queen here. some reason at some time in the past. In the garden of the mill, in Saxon times, stood a small church, although the exact site is not completely known, And the graveyard of the church extended across these lawns and almost up to the mill itself. The house where we were staying was originally the stables of the mill, and it's thought that they date only from about the 18th century. So the cemetery could have extended over this entire piece of ground. There's been a mill on this site, recorded in Domesday Book, but this present building only dates from the 18th century. There have been several successive buildings on this same site. Here at the mill house, sometime during the 17th century, one of the millers and his son were murdered by a journeyman. He was eventually caught and hanged, and hung on a gibbet somewhere where the old public footpath runs, which was the road to Wickham Market.
However, there were a number of interesting leys. One runs along the straight stretch of the D-shaped moat surrounding Leatheringham Hall, where Wolsey once entertained Mary Rose, Henry VIII's sister. It goes across the island formed by the mill's waterworkings to the Abbey and Hoo Church. The Abbey is Leatheringham's parish church, once the nave of an Augustinian abbey. There seemed to be a definite rise in the ground at the point marked Mound. Another interesting line was of two clumps and a coincident track lining up with Easton Church, 13th century, but with a Saxon church mentioned in Domesday, almost certainly on the same site. Its octagonal tower is in a commanding position, visible from the road at Hoo. It was approaching the first line on the river that we got the bad feeling.